Welcome to the Health Tech Edge, the podcast on how technology is reshaping healthcare operations. I'm Mike Moore. Today, I'm joined by Michelle Mello. Dr. Mello is a professor of law at Stanford Law School and a professor of health policy at Stanford Medicine. She's also the lead author of a recent health affairs paper on AI and utilization review titled The AI Arms Race in Health Insurance Utilization Review Promises of Efficiency and Risks of Supercharged Flaws. The paper examines how AI is being used in prior authorization and claims processing, why adoption is accelerating so quickly, and where the real risks emerge as these systems scale. Michelle also works on real world AI assessments inside Stanford Healthcare, so this conversation is grounded in what actually is happening in healthcare, not just theory. Michelle, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And what caught me with the paper is that we see these themes in a lot of different conversations, but rarely from the academic point of view where there's some science and some study put into it. There's a lot of opinions, of course, that are characterized as news. But what I thought was important is calling out what you and the team have done from a research point of view. So let's start with kind of the title of the article, and it's a term that we've heard on the podcast before about the AI arms race. What is that AI arms race based on your perspective that you're seeing happen specifically in utilization review? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, commentators have adopted this term because I think this process of trying to win approval for prior authorization requests, as well as retrospective approvals of services already rendered, has long been described as adversarial, a kind of battle. I've heard physicians describe it in conferences as trying to win the game. And so both sides have sought to arm themselves with tools to help them win in an ever escalating battle to see how AI might be able to help.
Yeah, and I think that this is such a key area too, because not only are the physicians and the payers, right, the physician groups and the payers involved, but it's also patients are in the middle of this too, right? And they feel caught in the middle. I think I've seen, and this is again one of these uncited studies that say 4 out of 5 Americans are unhappy with the U.S. healthcare system, right? I think this comes down to it is feeling like when they're sick, they have to make the case for getting the treatment that's been prescribed, but feeling that resistance from their health insurance company, who most assume don't want to pay for things in general, never mind their specific needs, right? So there's a lot of emotions I think that are in the middle of this, and just kind of contributes to that arms race.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many reasons why patients might hate the US healthcare system, but having to deal with insurance denials is certainly right up there. It's worth pointing out that in theory, patients shouldn't be involved in prior authorization processes. It should be something that's handled between the provider and the insurer. But different providers have different levels of ability to support patients through initial denials. And that's where patients often feel like they get stuck with the process of appealing.
Yeah, I think especially if you're waiting for any kind of treatment, for whether it's for you as the patient or a loved one, and you're waiting to hear back, is kind of how it gets characterized. I don't think prior authorization has been in the vernacular until maybe recently with, at the patient level, right? But now all of a sudden people become aware of this step in the process. They're waiting to hear back. Has it been approved? I know, at least for my health plan, I won't name them, but there is a dashboard that I can log into and see the status of
Mhm,
PAs that have been submitted on my
mhm.
behalf. So I think people are getting more involved. So let's take it from kind of the perspective of the application of AI. Why do you think that AI is such a rich opportunity for utilization review?
Well, I think that especially in this early age of AI where we're still getting comfortable with its accuracy and our ability to really let down our guard and rely on it, there's a lot of appeal around applying it to tasks that seem kind of low level in terms of the amount of human brain power that needs to be involved most of the time. There's also a natural appeal in applying it to tasks that are highly repetitive and high volume, and for that reason, costly to support, whether the cost is in terms of hiring additional people to do it or having to do it yourself and have your time siphoned away from clinical practice. So it's a very good fit, at least in principle, for things that we would like AI to be able to do for us, to take away the drudgery, the irritating tasks, the tasks that, as doctors might say, just kind of suck my will to live. And from the insurer side, to cut costs around a process that, if humans are involved, can cost them $40 or $50 a claim for the most complex cases.
So do you feel like there are parts of the process that are better suited for AI and some that are not? I think that's part of what you were pointing out in the paper is that, we can't just apply AI. I'm not going to put words in your mouth. You can correct me on this, but we don't want to apply AI universally and just turn over control. Obviously, there is that human in the loop factor that's often referred to. But if we break up the process, are there pieces where you feel AI is more appropriate than others where it introduces more risk to the process?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. One is, there are different kinds of tasks involved in evaluating prior auth requests. I sort of blanket characterize this as being relatively low human brain power, but there are distinctions between, for example, requests that just involve simple coverage matching, like was this person on our health plan on January 2nd of this year, and did they have coverage for 21 physical therapy visits and not just 20? That seems like a great target for AI. And then second, alongside that, you know, even cases that do involve medical necessity determinations, which are harder, involve more assembly of information and more judgment. Uh, I think something that gets lost in the public debates about this issue is that most of those are going to be approved. They're gonna be yeses, and they're gonna be yeses because there's really not any dispute. If you've the information is readily available in the medical record to support those requests. And so again, like making it faster to get to yes seems like a great use of AI. And in doing so, we can then conserve human reviewers within health insurance companies for the hard cases, which are cases where it's not easy for AI to immediately say yes.
Right. I think that's also I believe, the government stepping in some of these areas, right? If you review for a particular diagnostic code that, you know, greater than 90% of the time it's approved, then why are we putting everyone through prior authorization processes for
Well,
these
that's
things,
a
right?
that's a great and separate question. So, one of my concerns about involving AI here is it makes it cheaper to do the wrong thing. Uh, if you think that prior authorization, just as a whole concept, is overused, as I believe it probably is, this makes it easier to perpetuate that. But indeed, if we are saying yes almost all the time for a service, especially a relatively inexpensive service, why are we putting physicians and patients through this in the first place for that particular service?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a key piece. Again, going back to the overall orchestration of all these pieces across physicians and payers and the patients, again, who I feel are caught in the middle, is that if we're always likely to say yes, then having something more streamlined for that process. And I think to your point too, there is kind of the piece of it. We talk sometimes on the podcast about helping clinicians operate at the top of their license, right? That there's a lot of administrative pieces that don't necessarily require their training and education and experience. They're administrative in nature, but still require that they participate in that. I think that's where a lot of the vendors are pulling in, different pieces. I know that's a part of your study, right? Is that you looked at vendors and how they kind of pull together
Yeah.
information. Of course, they're making promises about speed and efficiency and consistency and all of that. So, what role do you see vendors playing both today, or kind of where do you think they should be focusing in the future?
Well, thinking about those that are marketing to the provider side, I mean, they are really noticing important opportunities to fix dumb problems in the prior auth process. Uh, Sometimes it is physicians putting in these requests. At a big organization like the one that I work at Stanford Healthcare, it's not the physician. The physician sort of says to somebody, hey, this thing needs to be done. And then we've got over 100 people, many of whom, may not be educated beyond the high school level. They certainly don't have clinical training at the lowest level, who are putting in these requests. And they're doing their very best to comb through a medical record, the volume of which may, for many patients, exceed, the length of Moby Dick, and find the clinical information that supports the medical necessity requests. AI is pretty good at looking through medical records and finding discrete, easily described pieces of information. So again, it seems very natural that vendors would be identifying this market opportunity. The second opportunity comes from realizing that when prior auth requests are denied, it is very often because there was information not that wasn't satisfactory in a substantive way to the insured, but that was missing or incomplete. So if it's not exactly that we are having a substantive fight about medical necessity, but just that the form was not filled out well or quickly or fully, again, that's a great opportunity for automation that can not only populate this field, but before you click submit, check that there's nothing missing. That way we don't waste everybody's time having to turf that back because it wasn't complete.
Yeah, I know how important my wife is a registered nurse, and so I know that she was taught, when she went through nursing school about completeness of information and documentation and note taking and how important all that detail is. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The checking for consistency in the information, or knowing also, and I think this is kind of the learning nature of some of these AI software products. They can learn and understand that typically this is a type of diagnostic code that is return back for incomplete information
Hmm.
because it usually needs this, and kind of doing that consistency
Right.
checking and making sure the accuracy. But I think another point that you and the team make in the paper is that having that learning from history nature of some of these AI tools could be quite beneficial, but it also could be repeating some of the bad patterns of the past. So, can you talk a little bit about what you looked at there in terms of the learning nature of AI?
Yeah. So, that comment arose from an evaluation that my team here at Stanford did of a tool that we were considering adopting for use in our hospitals. It was actually a tool related to appealing denials of prior authorization and claims. Understanding that even with more than 100 people working this side of things, we can't appeal everything. We don't have the bandwidth to do that, and sometimes the hospital just has to let it go. This tool was, supposed to help prioritize which of the claims that were initially denied was most likely to be paid if appealed. And it was payer specific, and the way it would do that is in part by examining the past payment record of the insurer. A savvy insurer may come to understand what its incentive is in this scenario. The more you say no, 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 and I mean it, still no, the more the machine will learn that you are not to be trifled with on appeal, that is just futile to go up against you. So that's an example of a sort of learning feedback loop in AI that it makes sense. We, of course, would want to include the information on past payment rates in a predictive model. If we didn't, the model would be much less accurate. But by doing so, if that becomes known, it creates perverse incentives for insurers.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the cautionary tale here about all of this, is that there's uh, the human behavior that affects the AI programming, right, kind of potentially comes into this, where we start, and like you say, prioritizing, right? We don't have the ability to appeal all of these denials. So let's be selective about it. Let's prioritize those based on the data and what the data tells us. But if the human behavior is attempting to manipulate, the inputs that affect the outputs, or, right, like there's just
Yeah,
a vicious cycle that could be started there.
let me just offer a friendly amendment, which is right now it's human behavior, but I expect that before too long, we will have agentic systems operating here that will be learning from each other. So
Mhm.
we will have routinely, now we have this sometimes now, but we will routinely have two AI systems speaking to each other and learning how to behave in the future based on how the other has behaved in the past.
Yeah, and again, the risks of these. We talk about the autonomous nature, and people kind of predicting the doom and gloom scenarios about artificial intelligence being the end of mankind and these kind of things. It's like there are many steps along the way in that process, right? But turning over decision making, or the reasoning around this and the manipulation, potentially in some of these scenarios, I think requires a lot of governance, and visibility and transparency in these systems and the way they make their decisions.
Yes.
Um, So there's also this kind of statement in the paper, I believe, about no denial without human review,
Mm.
um, and or a claim that could be made, associated with different software. What are you seeing in reality in terms of how that happens or doesn't happen?
Yeah, so this is the area where I feel that the public and policymaker debate about use of AI and prior auth gets most muddled. Um, Policymakers and journalists have consistently talked about AI, quote unquote, being used to deny care. And insurers respond by saying it's never the case that an AI system decides to deny care. Now, what they usually mean by that is that an AI system probably did review the file, but the final decision was made by a human. And in theory, that should be reassuring. That's how almost all AI in healthcare works. The AI makes a recommendation or it drafts some text, a human reviews, and it doesn't get pushed or implemented in care until that human has approved it. The problem in this case is that there's some evidence that suggests maybe medical reviewers aren't doing this in a thorough fashion, or face strong institutional pressure to ratify the AI's initial recommendation. Those claims may be false. I have no way of knowing. And the reason I have no way of knowing is that the insurers share so little information that would enable us to really understand exactly how they're using AI, what the outcomes are of the process, and whether those outcomes are systematically different than the outcomes in a human only system. So, in summary, there's lots of claims flying around. They're very inflammatory. They've gotten a lot of senators very hot under the collar. And I think the insurance industry would be well advised to share additional information beyond making simple and frankly misleading claims that they don't use AI to make care denials, really explaining how things work. Finally, I would say I would suspect that if they did that, they would tell us that this is how it works. The AI makes an initial recommendation, and then if it's a no, the human reviews and makes the final one. What is that human seeing? That's of great interest to me because we know the way the human brain works. When you frame a decision for the human brain, it will take all kinds of cues from the way in which that decision is framed. So, to use a very simple example, I just finished grading all of my final exams for my law school course. I got a blank page. I had a set of criteria and I applied it, and it was enormously time consuming. Now, suppose I had a teaching assistant who took on that task herself. She went through all the exams and then she wrote me a little summary of each exam saying, I think this exam is a B minus because it, didn't handle this particular legal issue very thoroughly. Don't you imagine that I might be influenced by that initial recommendation and that if we were to look over a large number of exams, my grading would probably look different than if I began with a blank page. So my recommendation to insurers is this: when the AI has not been able to say yes, let the human reviewers begin with a blank page. That way you can truly say that AI didn't play a role in this claim denial, and you can create the best possible conditions for the human reviewer to give it a fair shake. Will it cost more than curating a file and then asking a human to ratify it? Yes, it will, but I think it's well worthwhile, especially when we consider again that this is just a small minority of all prior auth requests.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, especially because the one thing we don't all have visibility into from the outside is what the case volume looks like. Because I think that when people have a large volume of cases that they're supposed to look after within a given day or week or whatever the time period is through which they're managed, for their own employee performance expectations or what the backlog looks like, or in the case of things like prior authorization, the clock is ticking, right? There's a time frame that's mandated for the review
Hmm.
that has to be met, and I think the time frame, and the penalties around that, I think, is escalating, right? As kind of the government goes. So that's,
Yeah,
there is definitely pressure in the system.
that's a great point. And I think well-intentioned legislators have been and CMS have been rationing down that time that insurers have to turn around prior auth requests out of a desire to help patients. But as you say, this creates pressure in the system. It creates more and more incentive not to be thorough when you're just trying to meet that quota and get that turnaround.
which just feeds into the if I'm looking at a summary and it's giving me a green thumbs up, recommend
Right.
approval, and that may be fine. But if it's recommending denial, I think that's probably the more risky scenario, or that's where I think we
Yeah,
see
and
more
and
opportunities for abuse in the system.
and I might even go a little bit farther and say, if it's saying yes, I don't think we probably need human review unless the insurer in its monitoring in the system sees, for example, holy cow, now we're saying yes to this drug a lot more than we were last year. Now that's like maybe a for cause human intervention might be appropriate. But again, when we say yes in the insurance industry, it's often because it's pretty much a no-brainer. So why require humans in that situation? It doesn't disadvantage anybody but the insurer, and with proper monitoring, they should be able to pick up if the AI system is doing something different than their historical practice.
Sure. Um, in the review that you've done and kind of these processes and the work with the team, how concerned are you about hallucination in AI at this point?
In general, I'm concerned. I don't have any information about how often it occurs in this specific context. Um, certainly when we look in other areas where AI is used to make sophisticated text, it is a very common problem. For example, in my field, in the legal field, about 1 in 6 AI generated, legal summaries or briefs contains a hallucination. So, I think, but human editors, I think, are understandably on alert for those hallucinations. Here's the challenge in this specific context, though. Whereas, as a lawyer or as a physician, I'm in a pretty good position to be able to notice that something seems off and to go look it up and to have the sophistication and knowledge that enables me to do those things. Again, if we're talking about these prior auth requests being submitted by somebody who does not have clinical training, they may not be well situated to be a good supervisor and catch and correct those hallucinations, unless they're obvious. Sometimes a man gets a uterus, attributed to him in a generative AI summary. That's an easy case, but for harder cases, I do worry about that. The insurer, of course, has an incentive to detect and correct these hallucinations on its end of when a provider submits one, and vice versa. So as long as we're kind of opaque about what the text is that we're objecting to, in theory, it should correct itself over time, unlike in other processes in medicine and law where there's no kind of other side that's checking this document before a decision is made.
Yeah, it's I don't know if you're watching the show The Pit on HBO, but as we
Yes.
record this here in January of 2026, I think episode 2 of season 2 has just come
Mhm.
out, and they're using an ambient, or one of the doctors is using an ambient listening tool during an
Right.
exam, and then kind of showing that to some of the medical students there. And just like many things with The Pit, having watched the first season, these kind of little details in early episodes turn into, kind of bigger stories later on. So I'm interested to see where that piece of this goes.
Mm.
Uh,
Yes, I mean, of course, none of these are foolproof. But this use, again, it seems like lower stakes than other uses of generative AI where we are relying on them with relatively light human review, because I think there is the possibility for errors to get corrected through this back and forth appeals process.
so let's talk a little bit about your hands-on experience there at Stanford. You want to tell us about the group that you're part of there and kind of what your mission is within the system?
Yeah, I run a group called the Healthcare Ethical Assessment Lab for AI, or HEAL AI for short. We are a publicly funded research lab. We do scholarly work, and we also have a role helping Stanford Healthcare, which is a multi hospital system that cares for over 1 million patients a year, evaluate many of the proposed AI tools that may be implemented in our facilities. Governance process has several different components, but we focus on trying to proactively spot and address ethical problems.
And so when you see cases come in, I have to imagine that you have kind of a process that you work through or checklist that you go through that you evaluate. Do you want to talk a little bit about the process?
Yeah, again, because these are kind of early days for healthcare AI in general, and understanding kind of what the ethical issues are that can arise from it, we have taken the approach of really consulting stakeholders in depth about what their values and concerns are around particular AI tools. So over time, we're starting to develop kind of mental checklists of things like, well, okay, if it's an insurance related tool, here's, 5 or 7 things that have come up in the past. We want to make sure we think about this. Um, but for many tools, it's the kind of first in class thing. And so what we do is interview patients. We have a learning community of Stanford patients and caregivers who have been trained in the AI fundamentals. They've been with us now for almost 18 months. We convene focus groups of these patients to talk through tools, again, focusing on what matters to patients, what they're worried about, what they're excited about, and what advice they would have for the institution. We also talk to people who will be the users of these tools. Sometimes they're active users, they're already piloting it, or sometimes they're prospective users. And they give us really valuable information about, first of all, how excited they are about the use case, how much benefit they think it could bring, but also thinking about their workflow. Um, how sanguine are they about the prospects for this tool, which is presumably performed pretty well in testing, to actually work out that well in practice? And again, there's just a number of interrupters of benefit that can occur because of the way it's being used or because of limitations in our capacity to provide various follow-up services to patients. And then we also interview people who are involved in developing the product, and or developing a plan to implement it at Stanford to make sure that it's a good, it's a solution that fits the problem well, and they've thought through workflow concerns. So we synthesize all this information and we generate a report to a high level committee at Stanford Healthcare, who then combines it with other considerations to make a decision about whether to greenlight use of this tool.
So based on your experience and some of the real cases that have come in with different solutions being proposed, have you identified kind of a single biggest mistake or a couple of key mistakes that you see leaders or that you want to advise other leaders to avoid as they're kind of considering making progress? I think a lot of organizations have a big agenda around making some big steps forward with AI in 2026. So, what are some things you think they could
Yeah,
avoid?
it's a great question. I think a lot of the potential problems that we end up focusing on relate to workflow, that, our assumptions about how the humans interacting with this tool are going to behave realistic given the demands of their job. Um, for example, a common thing that we see is the organization kind of putting responsibility on nurses and doctors to edit generative AI output before it gets submitted to the record or sent to patients, and telling them, it's your license on the line, that, you'd be named in a lawsuit if you get this wrong. But the whole reason that we're adopting these tools, physicians and nurses don't have enough time. And so there's a lot of tension between sometimes organizational expectations about humans as supervisors of AI and the on the ground reality about how people work. And that's certainly a problem that applies to the insurance tools that we've been discussing. Again, not only do we have possible gaps in their clinical expertise, but organizational incentives that may push them to go fast, to ratify initial AI decisions or not depart from them very often, and various other pressures. So that's certainly a big one.
Yeah, I think we've talked on the podcast in past episodes about pajama time, right? Those evening hours when clinicians are spending time editing notes or updating charts and those kind of things. And, this goal of reducing it to try to relieve some of that burden. But I do think it's an excellent point that there how do we distribute that work elsewhere, to the appropriate individuals, right? And kind of maximize again, helping people operate at the top of their license or even for non-licensed professionals, giving them tools to better execute on whatever piece of the puzzle that they have.
Yeah, I guess I'm not optimistic that can be delegated to other humans, but I think that with more study and monitoring, we can often develop a good sense of where the failure modes are in the product. Like, what kinds of patients or decisions does it really just kill, like, it does it really well. We can go to bed and rest easy without spending a lot of time reviewing that decisions. And then where does it maybe underperform a little bit, or we have reason to think it might underperform? So to go back to your AI scribe example for, just to touch on that, I think these things, tend to work really, really well when you've got a single person in the room with a physician. They are a native English speaker who speaks unaccented English, and they have very few medical issues that they're discussing, and none of them are psychiatric. You change any of those conditions, and now you've got a higher index of suspicion around error. So, part of addressing this problem may be helping users understand, hey, if you only have 30 minutes at the end of the day, or you only have 10 minutes at the end of the day, which are the instances of AI use that you probably want to focus your own vigilance on?
Yeah, excellent points. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for providing your insights and sharing both your research and your hands-on experience. I think it's been really insightful and very practical, as well as the advice you share at the end here about where to focus. And I also think the work that you're doing with the team in interviewing various stakeholders, including the patients themselves, and as well as the people who will use the tools, not just the people making selections, sitting in some nice office chairs somewhere, but the people behind the nurse's desk or out on the floor is really helpful. So we'll go ahead and put a link to the paper that we've mentioned, as well as to the Healthcare Ethical Assessment Lab for AI in the show notes. So if people want to look at both of those pieces of information, they can. So with that, we'll thank everyone for listening to Health Tech Edge. If the episode helped you think differently about AI and governance, please go ahead and share it with someone who's responsible for those decisions inside your organization. And with that, we'll go ahead and sign off. Michelle, thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks very much.